well, not least in one of the ways that he's told yet more lies. We found a clip yesterday, last night in fact, about council tax. Let's have a look at that, because only yesterday, we reported that basically council tax is going up in about 10 to 15 separate boroughs, in some cases in Windsor by 25%, and in lots of other places by 15%, by 10%, by 9%. But this is what Keir Starmer said before he was Prime Minister.
Labour would freeze council tax next year. Yes, you heard it right. Not a penny more on your council tax. Not a penny more than the bill you paid last year.
It seems remarkable. Let's say a very good morning to Theo Usherwood. Theo, very good morning to you.
Well, good morning to you.
It seems remarkable to me that there are so many of these types of clips of Keir Starmer, because it's one thing to, promise something, it's one thing to kind of, suggest something, but he's so sure that these things are not going to happen. And this is not the only instance of it. I mean, what sort of an individual would make those kinds of absolutely bold statements and then completely disregard them? I mean, even by political standards.
It was political expediency at the time. So Keir Starmer identified issues that he thought were close to the public's heart, whether that be council tax, whether that be the WASPy women. And he was quick, of course, to make promises that sided him on the right side of the British public, with the British public against the government of the day. That's what he did, right? Now, the problem he had was he wasn't able, having come into government, he wasn't able to back it up. So whether it be the winter fuel allowance, whether it be council tax, or whether it be the WASPy woman, he's ended up in a situation where he's had to break those promises. And the British public, and it's always been the case, Mike, trust is hard earned and easily lost. The British public don't really care for that. They don't mind you telling it like it is, right? They don't mind politicians telling them like it is, that times are really tough. We've got to be honest from the outset. What they don't like is they don't like hypocrisy. They don't like being told one thing and then, or a pivot. They don't like being told one thing and then something else turns out to be true. And that's the problem he's got.
Well, my interest in this is slightly more, from the point of view of the mentality of somebody. I mean, is it now the case that government advisors or political advisors, if you're not in government, say, look, just say whatever you want, because at the end of the day, either one, nobody will remember, or two, you can just say that times have changed and things have changed and the world has moved on and now we can't do that. But it's almost like there are different... I mean, he could have said that in a variety of different ways. He could have said, look, we understand that, local councils are under pressure, but we will do our level best to make sure that council tax does not rise when we get into power. Instead of which, he makes a big song and dance about it and says, not a penny more will you pay. He's very clear about it. It's not just a kind of suggestion that you might then find fault with later on. It's an absolute hard-fire promise.
Yes, you're quite right. There is a way of couching it, and there are issues. If you think back to the election, where people were saying to Rachel Reeves, for instance, that you can see the books, you can see the way the public finances look, and you can be perfectly honest about whether they're going to be tax rises. And she danced on the head of the pin and said, well, actually, later on we didn't know the details. But I think it's best if you're providing, as a in opposition, to be as honest as possible. Right. The sensitivity that Labour have, and many of your older listeners will understand this. This isn't their first rodeo with politicians who don't tell the truth, right? They will understand this. Labour have a problem when it comes to high tax and high spending, and that's what they were sensitive about. People remember what happened in the 1970s, where you had Labour governments and you had, the graves weren't being dug, the bins weren't being emptied, the unions were running the show. People were very, Labour was very sensitive to that charge. They would, in government, it would be the same as the 1970s. It would be taking us back. And Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves wanted to get across the message that they could be trusted with the public finances. Unlike Jeremy Corbyn, they could be trusted with the nation's security, and they were prepared to do anything to uphold that idea that they could be trusted with both of those things. And the problem they have is, of course, they knew when they came into government, really tough decisions were going to have to be made about public spending. Really tough decisions if they wanted to do the things they wanted to do. Because the alternative, of course, was to say to the trade unions, no, you can't have a public sector pay rise. You can't have that extra, you can't have that 15% RMT. You can't have that 22% junior doctors. You can't have that 7 or 8% teachers. That's the alternative. But of course, they'd also promised pay rises, or had indicated to the trade unions, if you give us our backing, we will ensure that public sector.
But they kept their word to the trade. But they kept their word to the trade unions, didn't they? Because they got sorted out pretty much as soon as they got in. But this also contradicts the taxes for working people. When people used to absolutely, fixate on what do they mean by working people? Does that mean they're going to tax pensioners? Does that mean they're going to tax people who aren't working? Or does it mean they're going to tax savings? It meant that they wouldn't put up council tax, because council tax is a tax on working people. So they've lied about that as well.
Yes, they're gonna. It's a tax on working people. Working people pay council tax if you're in a rented property, or if you're in if you're in your own home, you pay council tax, and it also is pernicious against people on fixed incomes. I'm thinking of pensioners. Okay, many of those pensioners are going to have a single homes discount, right?
Yeah.
But many of them will still be living as a couple, and they are going to be they don't get a discount, and the tax goes up, and their income doesn't go up. They've got no way. In Windsor, if you're living in your home, is your income going to go up by 25%? No. So that it's reflective of the fact that council tax is going. Of course, it's not going to go up by 25%. You are going to be materially poorer, and you could say, well, it's Windsor, it's in, it's a royal borough, it's a royal county, or in the royal county of Buckinghamshire. Sorry, it is. You can make the argument that Windsor is beyond. Actually, it's Berkshire, but you can make it's just rich people who live in Windsor.
Right.
But actually,
but that's not true either.
That's not true either. It's not a fair way to go about things. And I think, the other thing about council tax is that watch what happens in this spending review to the allocation of money for Angela Rayner's Communities Department.
Yeah.
Because that's the money that goes to councils. So the reason that councils are having to put up council tax is that they have seen swinging cuts, actually, which go back to 2010. But that should, that is not a protected department, Mike Graham. So you could end up, we could, and I think this is probably very likely, whilst the NHS will get more money, because it is a protected department, the Department for Communities is likely to see cuts. And it's those cuts which then filter down to local government and pay for services. I mean, we're going to talk about Prevent and money, whether Prevent miss Rudabakana. But it's also worth remembering that local government pays for things like social services. And there are going to be questions, just as there are going to be questions for Prevent, there are rightly going to be questions for local councils, for local NHS provision in terms of child and adolescent mental health services, why they didn't pick up Rudabakana. And the argument will come back, well, there wasn't enough resource, or we didn't have enough resource. But that's what they say about everything, to deal with it.
That's what they say about everything. And then if you look at how much their budget is, and you go, well, you may be just badly allocating it. There's plenty of money swirling around in the public services. There's no shortage of people. But yet they're always claiming there's not enough people, there's not enough money. It's like the NHS are claiming, despite getting £200 billion a year, they haven't got enough money. Rubbish. They've got plenty of money. They've just got bad management.
And people want, when it comes to services, what's interesting about these particular services, right, is they're really important for keeping the public safe. Social services, whether it's Sarah Sharif, whether it's Rudabakana, completely opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of those particular cases, right? One was a very vulnerable little girl, one was a maniacal murderer who stabbed 3 people.
Yeah.
But in both cases, we need people to do their job. And to pick up these cases and to ensure that they never reach the conclusion that tragically that they reached in both of those individual cases. And I think going into this spending review, it's going to be very interesting to see whether actually Rachel Reeves, she needs to reassure the bond markets, the money men in the square mile and beyond, foreign investors right across the world. They don't like the look of UK PLC right now.
No.
And in order to assure them and assuage any concerns that they have, we're going to see some pretty brutal cuts probably towards the end of March. And one of the departments that's going to face those cuts is going to have a knock-on impact on the ability, their money ultimately goes to the services that need to keep the British public safe from the likes of Sarah Sharif's father and from the likes of Axel Rudabakana.
Absolutely right. We're going to be talking more about extremism with Dr. Paul Stott from the Policy Exchange in a little while. But let me ask you about the Attorney General, Lord Hermer. He's in the paper again today, basically admitting that there have been times when he's had to recuse himself. And for people who don't use that word very often, it means take himself out of the room, basically, and not give advice to the government because of potential conflicts of interest. It seems to me that this guy, who's a very good friend of Keir Starmer's from his legal days, has got an awful lot of conflicts of interest because he's represented an awful lot of what you might call high-profile and sometimes controversial figures and sometimes controversial cases. So I would put it to you that actually he's not the right man to be the Attorney General.
Well, it's true. You know, there is, you know, the Attorney General is often appointed from the legal profession. The problem that Lord Hermer, as you rightly point out, Mike, has got is the number of cases where he's represented individuals who are acting against the British government or are being acted upon by the British government. That's the issue, and therefore there's obviously a conflict of interest. And I don't really understand why it had to be dragged out of Lord Hermer. I mean, it was going on a week before we actually got, you know, the British public and MPs in the House of Commons in. And this was off the back of Robert Jenrick's letter, which was, you know, a fair point to raise from the Shadow Justice Secretary. You know, actually literally had to drag the information out of him that he had recused himself in these particular cases. It should be very easy for Lord Hermer and for the Cabinet Office and his office to be able to say whether he's provided advice in these particular cases and there was a conflict of interest. But the point, you know, you make is that there's Shamima Begum, if I remember correctly. There's also Jerry Adams, if I remember.
There's some asylum seekers coming into Britain from the Chagos Islands.
You know, these are the British. You know, I think it's a really simple thing when it comes to, you know, the view of the British public, right? They want to know, ultimately, that the people in government are on their side, or on the side of the British government. Do you see what I mean?
Well, at least they're on the side of Britain,
They're on the side of Britain. Yeah, you know, your listeners want to know that Mike Graham, as their breakfast show, as their essential common sense listening in the morning, you're on their side.
Yeah, of course.
But at the same time, I also think that the British public, your listeners, also want to know that the Prime Minister and that those he appoints in government are ultimately on the side of them. They're on the side of the British people, on the side of the British taxpayer. Because, you know, these cases where Lord Hermer has represented these particular individuals, they're going against the interests of the British government. We are spending taxpayers' money on lawyers to fight these cases.
Yeah.
And I'm not, on that basis, I don't understand why Keir Starmer would necessarily see that Lord Hermer, for all of his expertise, is a good appointment. It just comes down to some real basics.
He's really not a good appointment, and I don't think he's going to last. But there we are. Theo, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Theo Usherwood, political commentator, with the latest on the terrible state of this government.